Imagine waking up inside a pitch-black cave. The exit is blocked by an immovable boulder, and a massive, one-eyed giant is slowly dragging your friends into the firelight to eat them alive. Odysseus, the mastermind of the Trojan horse, lived this reality as he tried to lead his fleet of 12 ships and 600 men back across the Aegean Sea. They had just won a decade-long siege. Odysseus naturally assumed his trials were over. His only focus was getting back to his small island kingdom of Ithaca, where his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus had been waiting 10 years for his return. The 10 years they spent at Troy were finally over, but they were now sailing into a 20-year psychological and physical meat grinder that would eventually claim nearly every life in the fleet. To escape that cave, Odysseus engineered a gruesome, brilliant plan. He waited for the giant Polyphemus to pass out drunk, then drove a red-hot, sharpened wooden stake straight into his single eye. The next morning, Odysseus and his surviving crew slipped past the blinded monster by hiding underneath the bellies of the giant's own sheep. They made it back to the ships. They were safe. But as they sailed away, Odysseus let his ego take the wheel. He couldn't resist taking the credit. Standing on the deck, he screamed his true name back at the bleeding monster on the shore. That single moment of pride changed the course of the journey. Polyphemus was the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea. By shouting his name across the water, Odysseus issued a direct challenge to the ocean itself. Poseidon swore a divine oath of vengeance, ensuring that every wave between Odysseus and his home would now harbor a lethal trap. Even with a god hunting them, they almost made it. The wind god, Aeolus, gave Odysseus a heavy leather bag tightly binding every storm wind in the world. He left only a gentle breeze blowing straight toward Ithaca. After 9 days of sailing, they were so close that Odysseus could physically see the campfires burning on his home shores. Exhausted, Odysseus finally closed his eyes. But his men, convinced that the heavy leather bag was secretly filled with gold, waited until he was asleep and ripped it open. In a fraction of a second, a screaming hurricane erupted from the bag, blowing the entire fleet backward into uncharted, terrifying waters. They washed up on the island of Circe, a powerful sorceress with a deceptively warm welcome. She invited the starving, desperate soldiers into her luxurious palace and fed them a lavish feast spiked with a dark potion. Before their eyes, the men grew thick skin and hooves, physically transforming into squealing pigs. Odysseus, tipped off by the gods, chewed a divine herb called moly that made him entirely immune to Circe's magic. He forced her at sword point to turn his men back, but while her poison failed, her luxury proved even more effective. Surrounded by endless wine, food, and absolute comfort, the battle-weary king stopped trying to leave. A full year evaporated inside her palace walls. Circe's palace demonstrated that total comfort could be more lethal than any monster. Without a single drop of blood spilled, her hospitality had achieved what the Trojans couldn't. It made the men forget they ever wanted to go home. To break the spell of complacency, Circe gave Odysseus a chilling instruction. To find his way home, he had to sail to the edge of the world and enter the underworld. There, among the drifting spirits of the dead, he suffered a crushing psychological blow. He saw the ghost of his own mother. She had died in Ithaca, grieving and waiting for a son who never came. Armed with a prophecy from the dead, he sailed back into the realm of the living, directly into the territory of the Sirens. These were terrifying creatures perched on jagged ocean rocks, singing a hypnotic, impossibly beautiful melody that forced sailors to deliberately crash their own ships to pieces. Odysseus knew he needed to hear the song to navigate, but he couldn't trust his own mind. He took beeswax, melted it down, and shoved it deep into the ears of his men. Then he ordered them to bind him to the ship's mast with heavy ropes, with strict orders to ignore his screams. He thrashed and begged to be released as the music clawed at his deepest desires, but his deafened crew just kept rowing. Surviving the Sirens only brought them to a narrow, inescapable strait of water. On one side churned Charybdis, a massive whirlpool that swallowed the ocean 3 times a day. On the other side lived Scylla, a monster with 6 heads and 3 rows of razor-sharp teeth. Odysseus had to make a horrific calculation. Staring into the whirlpool meant the entire ship would be instantly dragged to the bottom, so he chose the beast. He stood on the deck, aware of what would happen, and listened to his 6 bravest men scream his name as they were plucked into the air and eaten alive. He sacrificed them so the rest could live. But the remaining crew sealed their own fate a month later when, starving and desperate, they slaughtered the sacred, magical cattle of the sun god. In retaliation, Zeus hurled a massive lightning bolt directly into the ship. The wood splintered into matchsticks. The crew drowned in boiling water. 20 years after leaving for Troy, Odysseus washed up on the shores of Ithaca completely alone. He finally reached his kingdom, only to find it unrecognizable. Over 100 wealthy, violent lords from across the region had essentially invaded his palace. Believing Odysseus was dead at the bottom of the sea, they were drinking his wine, butchering his livestock, and ruthlessly harassing Penelope, trying to force her to pick one of them as a new king. Penelope had stalled them for years, but she was out of time. She declared one final, impossible challenge. She brought out Odysseus's massive, rigid hunting bow. Whoever could string the weapon and shoot a single arrow cleanly through the small iron rings of 12 axe heads lined up in a row would become her husband. The arrogant suitors stepped up one by one. They strained, they sweated, and every single one of them failed to even bend the wood. The hall fell completely silent. Then a frail, ragged beggar who had quietly slipped into the palace stepped up to the line. He picked up the weapon, effortlessly bent it back, and let the arrow fly. It cleared all 12 rings perfectly. The beggar dropped his filthy rags to the floor. Standing before the terrified suitors was the true, battle-hardened king of Ithaca. For 20 years, Odysseus had endured the loss of his friends, the wrath of the gods, and the humiliation of returning home as a vagrant in his own house. That patience was gone. He was no longer a wandering survivor. He was an executioner. The palace doors slammed shut. Telemachus had bolted the locks from the inside. In a matter of minutes, the great hall turned into an absolute slaughterhouse. Odysseus's bow rained death on the men who had tormented his family, executing all 100 traitors with terrifying precision. The blood was wiped from the stone floors, but Penelope stood at a distance. She refused to blindly accept that this man, hardened and aged by 2 decades of violence, was her husband. She ordered her servants to lift their heavy marital bed and move it outside the bedchamber. Odysseus snapped. He yelled that moving the bed was physically impossible. Decades ago, he had carved one of the bedposts directly out of the living stump of a massive olive tree, building the entire room and the palace itself around its deep roots. It was a secret only the 2 of them knew. Hearing his outrage, Penelope broke down in tears and ran into his arms. The 20-year nightmare was over. Odysseus defeated monsters, witches, and the gods themselves. But he didn't do it with brute strength. He survived the longest, deadliest gauntlet in human mythology because he held on to the one thing the gods couldn't wash away, the unshakable memory of who he was and exactly who he was fighting to get back to.